The night Frank Sinatra sang for his life. The Villa Venice ultimatum. The threat didn't come in a letter. It didn't come in a whisper. It came as a promise delivered in a back room in Chicago, spoken by a man who had killed more people than he could remember. "You tell your friend Frank," Sam Giancana said, his voice low and devoid of any humanity, "that he has two choices. He can come to Chicago and do exactly what I tell him to do. Or he can stay in Palm Springs, and I will send some boys down there to cut his vocal cords out of his throat." It was October 1962. Frank Sinatra was the most famous entertainer in the universe. He walked with presidents. He dined with kings. He had millions of dollars in the bank and the world on a string. But when that message reached him, Frank Sinatra stopped walking. He stopped singing. And for the first time in a decade, he stopped breathing. Because Frank knew Sam Giancana. He knew that Momo, the boss of the Chicago outfit, didn't make idle threats. He knew about the bodies found in trunks. He knew about the ice picks and the wire garrotes. And he realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that all his fame, all his money, and all his awards couldn't stop a bullet. This is the untold story of the Villa Venice. The story of the 8 nights in 1962 when the Rat Pack didn't perform for money, or for glory, or for the fans. They performed because there was a gun pointed at Frank Sinatra's head. It is the story of the moment the devil came to collect his debt, and the night Frank Sinatra learned that you can never, ever, truly leave the mob. To understand the terror of that autumn, you have to look at the deal Frank had made. For years, he had been the bridge between Hollywood and the underworld. He enjoyed the protection of the outfit. He loved playing the tough guy. He loved the respect he got from men who carried guns. He thought they were his friends. He thought he was one of them. But Frank had made a fatal mistake. He had promised Sam Giancana that if the mob helped get John F. Kennedy elected, the federal government would back off. He had promised immunity. And he had failed. Kennedy won, but instead of backing off, the administration launched the biggest war on organized crime in American history. Robert Kennedy was tearing the Chicago outfit apart. Subpoenas were flying. Wiretaps were everywhere. The heat was unbearable. Sam Giancana felt betrayed. He felt that Frank Sinatra had used him and thrown him to the wolves. And in Sam's world, when someone fails you, they pay. The price was the Villa Venice. The Villa Venice was a roadhouse on the outskirts of Chicago. It was a gaudy, tacky, mob-owned gambling den that had seen better days. It was losing money. Giancana wanted to turn it into a gold mine, and he decided that Frank Sinatra was going to be the shovel. The demand was simple. Frank had to come to the Villa Venice. He had to bring Dean Martin. He had to bring Sammy Davis Jr. They had to perform twice a night for 8 straight nights, and they had to do it for free. No paycheck, no percentage of the door, no expenses covered, just Frank Sinatra, the highest-paid singer in the world, working as a slave to pay off a debt of disrespect. When Frank got the order, his first instinct was to fight. He was the chairman of the board. He didn't take orders. He paced around his living room in Palm Springs, pouring drink after drink, ranting to his bodyguards. "Who does he think he is? I made him legitimate. I introduced him to the president." But then, the phone call started. Not to Frank, to the people around him. Quiet warnings, mentioning his children, mentioning his private plane, mentioning accidents that happen on lonely desert roads. Frank realized he was trapped. He realized that to Sam Giancana, he wasn't a legend. He was just a canary. A pet bird that could sing, or a pet bird that could be crushed. It didn't matter to Sam. Frank swallowed his pride. It tasted like ash. He picked up the phone and called Dean Martin. "Dino," Frank said, his voice sounding older than his years. "I need a favor." Dean listened. Dean, who hated being told what to do, who hated the cold Chicago winters, who didn't owe the mob anything. But Dean heard the fear in Frank's voice. He heard the desperation. And because Dean Martin was the most loyal friend a man could ever ask for, he didn't hesitate. "Tell me when and where, Pally," Dean said. "I'm there." Sammy was next. Sammy Davis Jr. knew the stakes better than anyone. He knew what men like Giancana did to people who looked like him, but he also knew that without Frank, he wouldn't be where he was. "I'm in, Frank. We're a family. We stick together." So, in November 1962, the Rat Pack descended on Chicago. It wasn't like the Sands. It wasn't the glitz and glamour of Las Vegas. The Villa Venice was a fortress. It was surrounded by armed guards. The parking lot was filled with black Cadillacs belonging to every hitman, bookie and capo in the Midwest. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The audience wasn't made up of adoring fans or high-rolling tourists. It was made up of made men, wise guys, killers in silk suits sitting with their wives and mistresses, staring at the stage with cold, dead eyes. They weren't there to applaud. They were there to watch the great Frank Sinatra bow down to their boss. Backstage, the tension was so thick you could choke on it. The dressing room was small and smelled of stale beer. There was no laughter, no practical jokes. Dean sat in the corner, drinking scotch, looking bored but alert. Sammy was pacing, fixing his tie over and over again. And Frank Sinatra was terrifyingly quiet. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tuxedo. He looked at his reflection. He saw the king of the world, but he felt like a court jester dancing for the king's amusement. He knew that Sam Giancana was out there, sitting at the center table, smoking a cigar, waiting to see if Frank would break. "5 minutes, Mr. Sinatra," a voice called out. It wasn't a stage manager. It was one of Giancana's soldiers, a subtle reminder of who was really running the show. Frank turned to Dean and Sammy. He tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "Let's get this over with," he said. They walked onto the stage. The band struck up the opening notes. The lights hit them. And for the next 90 minutes, they performed the show of their lives. It was a masterclass in professionalism. They sang. They danced. They told jokes. They poured drinks. They were electric. Dean was effortlessly cool, sliding across the stage as if he didn't have a care in the world. Sammy was a ball of energy, tap dancing until his feet blurred, and Frank sang with a ferocity that was almost frightening. He sang "Luck Be a Lady." He sang "I've Got You Under My Skin." He hit every note perfectly. He projected power, charisma, and dominance. To the untrained eye, he was in complete control. But if you looked closely, if you looked at his eyes, you could see it. The rage, the humiliation, He was singing to the men who were holding a gun to his head, and he had to make them like it. Sam Giancana sat in the front row, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. He watched Frank sweat. He watched Frank work. He watched the man who thought he was bigger than the mob realizing that he was just an employee. Every time Frank told a joke, he had to look at Giancana. Every time the audience laughed, it was because Giancana allowed them to laugh. It was a power play of the highest order. Giancana was showing the entire underworld. Look at him. Look at the great Sinatra. He dances when I say dance. After the show, there was no party, no hanging out at the bar. The Rat Pack went straight to their limousines and were driven back to their hotel under armed guard. They did this for 8 nights, 16 shows. By the 4th night, Frank was unraveling. He wasn't sleeping. He was drinking heavily, even for him. He snapped at the musicians. He threw a tray of food against the wall in his suite. He felt the walls closing in. He felt the weight of the devil's bargain crushing his chest. One night, after the 2nd show, Giancana came backstage. The room went silent. Dean put down his drink. Sammy froze. Frank stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. Giancana walked up to Frank. He was shorter than Frank, but in that room, he was a giant. He reached out and patted Frank on the cheek. A gentle, patronizing slap. "You're doing good, Frankie," Giancana said. "Business is booming. We're making a fortune out there." Frank stared at him. He wanted to hit him. He wanted to kill him, but he did nothing. He stood there and took it. "Just remember," Giancana whispered, leaning in close so only Frank could hear. "You belong to us. You always have. You always will. Don't ever forget who made you." Then he turned and walked out, leaving Frank standing in the middle of the room, stripped of his dignity, stripped of his illusion of freedom. That moment broke something in Frank Sinatra. It was the moment he realized that he could never wash the dirt off his hands. He had invited the vampire into his house, and now he was surprised that it wanted blood. The Villa Venice engagement ended. The Rat Pack flew home. They never talked about those 8 nights. It was a black hole in their memory, a shared trauma they buried under silence and whiskey. But the consequences followed Frank. Because of those shows, the FBI intensified their investigation. They saw Frank performing for the Chicago boss, and they had all the proof they needed. Frank Sinatra wasn't just a singer with bad friends. He was an associate. He was an asset of the Chicago outfit. A year later, the Nevada Gaming Control Board moved against him. They stripped Frank of his gambling license. They forced him to sell his shares in the Sands Hotel and the Cal Neva Lodge. They humiliated him, publicly, officially declaring him unfit to own a casino because of his ties to Sam Giancana. Frank lost millions. He lost his kingdom in Las Vegas. He was kicked out of the very paradise he had helped build. And it all started with that threat in Chicago. Sam Giancana eventually got his own ending. In 1975, he was cooking sausage and peppers in his basement when someone shot him in the back of the head. When Frank heard the news of Giancana's death, he didn't celebrate. He didn't mourn. He just poured a drink, walked to the window of his home in Palm Springs, and looked out at the desert. He had outlived the monster. He had survived the threat. He was still standing. But he knew the truth. He knew that a part of him had died on that stage at the Villa Venice. The part of him that believed he was free. The legend of Frank Sinatra tells us he was a man who did it my way. And mostly that is true. He fought, he loved, he lived on his own terms. But there was one week in 1962 when he didn't do it his way. He did it Sam Giancana's way. He sang because he had to. He smiled because he was forced to. He danced on the edge of a razor blade, knowing that one wrong step would mean the end of everything. That is the story they don't put in the musicals. That is the story that doesn't make it onto the greatest hits album. It is the story of a man who looked into the abyss and saw the mob staring back. So the next time you see footage of the Rat Pack, laughing and joking, looking invincible in their tuxedos, look a little closer at Frank. Look at the tension in his jaw. Look at the shadow in his eyes. That isn't just the look of a star performing. That is the look of a man who knows the price of the ticket. He saved his life that week in Chicago, but he paid for it with his soul. And until the day he died, Frank Sinatra carried the weight of the Villa Venice like a scar on his heart. A reminder that in the world he chose, nobody walks away clean. The music stopped, eventually. The lights went out. The wise guys are all gone now, buried in graves or prisons. The Villa Venice burned down years ago. But the echo remains. The echo of the greatest voice in history, singing in a smoky room for a room full of killers, praying that it would be enough to see the sunrise. It was the greatest performance of his life. because it was the only one where he was singing for his life. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the true cost of being the chairman of the board.